Good evening. Thank you so much for joining us. Those who are still at the reception can come on in and find a seat at their leisure. Those who have chosen the super comfy seats on the side are welcome. Yay! You're welcome to come on over if you'd like to. If you can't see or can't hear, our presenter has some slides tonight, so feel free to move on in and do what you need to do. Thank you so much for being here. We're grateful for everyone turning out for us tonight. We have an excellent program, so we're going to get started just as soon as we can. I'd like to welcome to the podium Dean Sergio Pareja, Dean of the UNM School of Law, and thank you all again for being here.
So good afternoon, everybody. Thank you all for being here today. As Hannah said, I'm Dean Sergio Pareja, and it's my pleasure to welcome you here today. I am delighted to see once again our very special guests. We've got, yet again, the members of the Chavez and Tristani family here today. And today we are honored to present the endowed U.S. Senator Dennis Chavez Memorial Lecture in Law and Civil Rights on the 10th anniversary of this lecture's endowment generously being established. So round of applause since we do have the 10th anniversary here. Now I would like to just take one moment and ask, not to embarrass you all, but I'd like to ask the members of both the Chavez and Tristani families and their special guests who are here to stand and be recognized. We are really grateful you're here with us. We also remember those who have been with us for prior lectures and think fondly of them on this occasion. In particular, I would like to remember the Honorable Gerard Thompson and the unforgettable Gloria Tristani Sr., who was the daughter of El Senador. So please take a moment to recognize them as well. Now, before I turn the podium to Gloria Tristani, who is junior, not senior, that she is the senator's granddaughter and special policy advisor with the National Hispanic Media Coalition, who will come up here and share a bit about the senator and his legacy for all of us. I would like to also recognize the many members and leaders of our faculty, the university, the business community, and our bench and bar who are here tonight as well. So welcome to all of you. There are actually too many to mention by name, but I hope as distinguished guests you will accept our sincere appreciation for your time and responsiveness. Now, today's lecture presents an opportunity to come together as a larger community around important topics that are as relevant today as they were in the senator's lifetime. The topic of tonight's lecture is timely and of significance for all of us. Now that said, will you please join me in welcoming to the stage our graduate and our friend, Gloria Tristani.
Thank you, Dean Pareja, for that kind introduction. I'm a little emotional, and I really appreciate you mention my late husband, the Honorable Gerard Thompson, who was a judge here in Albuquerque many years ago and in this district, and my dear mother, Gloria Chavez Tristani, who was really her father's daughter in every way, shape, and form, and who, till the age of 89, till she died, devoted her later years in preserving the memory of her father. Buenas tardes a todos. It really is good to be back in Albuquerque and to be in this building and not to be furiously writing out a final exam. On behalf of my family, I'm delighted to welcome you to this fourth Senator Dennis Chavez Memorial Lecture on Civil Rights. 10 years ago, as you heard, the Dennis Chavez Foundation and the Chavez family established an endowment to fund a memorial lecture focused on civil rights and celebrating Senator Chavez's extraordinary life and legacy. We thought it was fitting to commemorate his life by focusing on civil rights, the rights which he devoted his life to preserving and fighting for. My grandfather was unwavering in his belief that it is a moral responsibility to speak up loudly for equality and fairness and against discrimination or injustice, no matter how unpopular or politically risky. We also thought it was fitting because my grandfather believed that education was a key to a better life. Indeed, one of his first acts as a New Mexico state representative was to successfully pass legislation to provide free textbooks for all of the state's school children. And I would like to take a moment now to do a little promotion of my cousin, another granddaughter, Sissy Coy's book on Dennis Chavez, the first Hispanic U.S. Senator. It's in English and in Spanish on the other side. It is geared for elementary and middle school children. We are selling it today, and it is online. And I would also like to, and what I wanted to say is it's geared for children, but it's a nice read, even for adults. So last year, and before the Dennis Chavez Foundation dissolved, the foundation donated hundreds of copies of the book to the libraries at the Albuquerque Public Schools. Now, it was thanks to the existence of the Albuquerque Public Library in the early 1990s that my grandfather was able to read and continue his education when he had to quit school to help support his family. I hope this book will inspire young New Mexicans into a life of public service. Born to a humble family, largely self-educated, Dennis Chavez rose to the highest heights of political power and used that power to better the lives of his fellow New Mexicans, his fellow Americans, but particularly to help people most in need and who could not speak for themselves. And while my grandfather was fiercely American, he took enormous pride in his Spanish heritage. He loved Spanish literature. He loved our neighbors to the south, from Mexico to Argentina, and he did whatever he could to foster better relationships between our country and the Americas. In reflecting on the times we live in, I wonder what my grandfather would make of our country's current political climate, including the erosion of civil rights and liberties. From immigrant babies being ripped from their mother's arms to citizens in Puerto Rico being denied much-needed disaster relief and food assistance, to citizens and others being unfairly targeted by our government because of their race, ethnicity, or religion. Would he recognize the country he so loved and devoted his life to serving? I cannot guess what he would think, but I have no doubt what he would do. He would act and raise his voice against any kind of discrimination, bigotry, and injustice. He would raise his voice against the erosion of civil liberties. He would urge us to do the same. He would urge us to act and not to be discouraged. He would also urge us to get involved in our local communities and take actions to better the lives of our fellow human beings, particularly the disadvantaged and dispossessed. In that vein, I am delighted to introduce Professor Alvaro Bedoya, who will deliver this year's lecture. As you can see from the program, Professor Bedoya, who I know is Alvaro, has impressive credentials. He is the founding director of the Center on Privacy and Technology at Georgetown Law, where he is also a visiting professor. Alvaro is an expert on government surveillance and commercial data collection with a focus on the impact on immigrants and people of color. He has testified before Congress and state legislators, and his writing has appeared in the Washington Post and the New York Times. You can read on. But I would like to give you a sense of the Alvaro I know. I first met Alvaro a few years back when I was doing advocacy work on related issues, and we were both working with like-minded individuals and organizations. I was struck not only by Alvaro's intelligence, expertise, and leadership skills, but by the passion and commitment he brings to his work. Oh, and that's Alvaro's baby out there. I think my grandfather would approve of Alvaro, a Peruvian-born, naturalized American citizen who grew up in our country, but who deeply cherishes his Peruvian heritage. I think he would commend Alvaro's work on civil rights, as it involves the right to privacy, as it is challenged daily by the new world of technology. And I think my grandfather would particularly appreciate Alvaro's commitment to helping others in the community where he lives, the Washington, D.C. area, the Washington, D.C. metropolitan area. In 2009, Alvaro co-founded the Esperanza Education Fund, a scholarship and mentorship program that honors the brightest young immigrants students in the Washington region, regardless of ethnicity, national origin, or immigration status. To quote Alvaro on why he founded the fund, I think that every child, regardless of where they are from or what their papers say, has a right to a good education. I was honored to attend the fund's 2018 Scholarship Awards ceremony and to meet some of the deserving young recipients and their families. To date, the Esperanza Fund has awarded nearly $1 million in scholarships and helped almost 90 deserving students take steps to achieve their dreams and potential. Senator Chavez, too, believed everyone has a right to a good education. And as some of you may remember, before there was a University of New Mexico law school, there was the Dennis Chavez Law School. Let me explain. Before UNM was established in the 50s, there was no law school in the state, and few New Mexicans could afford to study out of state. My grandfather took it upon himself to recruit young New Mexicans to study law in Washington. He would then help them obtain jobs while they were studying. My grandfather didn't impose conditions. He must be able to review their grades, and the law students must be committed to returning to New Mexico once they graduated. A generation of New Mexico lawyers were the product of the Dennis Chavez Law School. With that, let me welcome our speaker and my good friend, Alvaro Bedoya. Thank you very much.
Buenas tardes. First of all, I am so grateful for that warm and generous introduction, Gloria. And I want to start this lecture by thanking you, Jorge Tristani, Jorge Thompson, Ceci Corey, and everyone in the Chavez and Tristani families who is here and who isn't here today. I am also deeply thankful to the University of New Mexico School of Law, Dean Pareja, Hannah Farrington, Carmen Rawls, Melissa Lobato, Katie Williams, and everyone in the communications, catering, audiovisual, janitorial staffs. I feel deeply, deeply fortunate to be here speaking with you in Senator Chavez's honor and in his memory. I also want to thank my wife, Sima, who traveled here with me with our 6-month-old daughter, Liana Lucila. This is actually Liana's first time hearing me speak, so either she'll like it or she'll start crying and fall asleep, in which case this will be her bedtime story. One of the joys of preparing this lecture was finding out about how Senator Chavez's legacy echoed through my family's life. I teach in the classrooms of a law school that admitted Dennis Chavez when he had at 30 years old, when he had just a 7th grade formal education. And every morning, Seema gets up and drives to the National Institutes of Health, where she is a clinical psychologist, which Senator Chavez was a driving force behind decades later when he was one of the most powerful people in our country. For all of these things, for all of you, I am grateful. Let me start by setting a scene. The country's most prominent political figure is a liar. He says that the sitting president is actually working for our enemies. He demeans war heroes, but lies about his own service. He is a demagogue. Foreigners are taking over our country, he says. Before, he says, no nation would dare do this to us. What happened to our honor? He says. He is effective, a fury on the campaign trail, with an uncanny ability to incite and hold a crowd. He undercuts basic institutions in our democracy, and people start to wonder, are lies more effective than the truth? This scene is not set in 2016 or 2019 for that matter. It is set in 1950, on May 12th, 1950. And I'm not quoting the 45th President of the United States. I'm quoting Joseph McCarthy, the late senator from Wisconsin. Joe McCarthy, who told the world that Harry Truman and the Democrats had committed, quote, 20 years of treason. Joe McCarthy, who derided George Marshall, yet lied his way into a distinguished flying cross. Joe McCarthy, who 2 months earlier stood at a Lincoln Day celebration in Wheeling, West Virginia, held up his hand and declared that he had a list of known communists who were working in our country's State Department. Joe McCarthy, who hauled people before the Senate, bullied them and shamed them, and in many cases ruined their professional lives, even though he often had no evidence of actual wrongdoing. May 12th, 1950. I want to call your attention to that date because it is 4 years before the Senate censured Joe McCarthy. It is 4 years before Joseph Welch would confront McCarthy and ask him if he had no decency. At long last, have you left no sense of decency? No. On May 12th, 1950, Joe McCarthy was ascendant. He was growing in prominence and popularity, and many other elected officials, including John F. Kennedy, would not denounce him. Yet it was on that day that the senator from New Mexico, Dennis Chavez, stood on the floor of the United States Senate and denounced Joseph McCarthy and his closest ally, a man named Louis Boudin's. Senator Chavez made clear that dissent was our strength, not a weakness. I contend that we are a nation of dissenters, he said. Your ancestors and my ancestors left Europe because they were dissenters. Our nation was created by dissenters. Our ancestors were not satisfied. The Declaration of Independence and the Constitution of the United States are based upon the fact that our ancestors were not satisfied with the way things were. And so Chavez explained, if you curb dissent, you don't just curb individual freedoms. You threaten our democratic way of life. He went on, the United States cannot gain strength from a population of safe people. People who have never thought or dreamed or spoken anything that is not prescribed and dictated by higher authority. If we accept only safe people, we become a slave people. Now, Senator Chavez, as Gloria and Dean Pareja have mentioned, was a powerful man. He was a powerful appropriator. And he used his power to protect the water rights of his constituents and of farmers. But he warned that it matters little if Congress appropriates hundreds of millions of dollars to check the erosion of the soil, if we permit the erosion of our civil liberties, free institutions, and the untrammeled pursuit of truth. Years later, colleagues would look back and say that it was this moment that started to turn the tide against Joseph McCarthy in the United States Senate. Because of Senator Chavez, quote, others dared speak out as well. Dionisio Chavez was born on April 8th, 1888, in the town of Los Chavez. He lived in a small house, dirt floors, no running water. And he rose from that house to become the first U.S.-born Hispanic to serve in the Senate, the fourth most senior member of the Senate, the chair of its most powerful subcommittee, and the chair of its Public Works Committee. Yet Chavez did not forget that house. He could not forget it. When Senator Chavez entered the Senate, there were no African-American senators, no Asian American senators, no Native American senators. It was just Dennis Chavez. One of his colleagues, in fact, would refer to him as the senator from Mexico. Not New Mexico, the senator from Mexico. That, my friends, was the senator from Mississippi. I looked this up. Theodore Bilbo, an unabashed racist who was 5'2" tall and often referred to himself in the third person. This is a true story. His colleagues would call him the man because that is what he would call himself. Theodore Bilbo. Now, once he arrived in the Senate, Dennis Chavez had a relentless focus on the disadvantaged and dispossessed. Oh, did I skip past Theodore Bilbo? Oh, wait. That's Theodore Bilbo. That's what I wanted you to see. He had a relentless focus on the disadvantaged and dispossessed. He sponsored legislation to empower Native Americans. He made sure that female nurses received the same pay as male officers of the same grade. He was the first to introduce a bill to fight discrimination in hiring during World War II, and that legislation would go on to become a foundation for modern civil rights legislation. Senator Stephen Young of Ohio would later say that, quote, Dennis Chavez was in many respects a very predictable man. He was always with the underdog. He was for the little fellows, whether they were struggling farmers fighting debts, drought, or low farm prices, underprivileged or forgotten American Indians, or working men seeking to better their lot and provide a more secure future for their children. At all times, he was the champion of the poor and the humble, a voice for the oppressed. Close quote. I see this lecture as a chance to advance Senator Chavez's legacy and his principles. And so far you've heard me speak about two of the senator's core commitments: his defense of individual freedom and civil liberty, and his belief in equality and promotion of civil rights. I want to talk to you about an idea at their intersection. I want to talk to you about the right to privacy. This might seem strange. Privacy, yes, it's one of our cherished and oldest civil liberties. Quote, the right most cherished by civilized men, said Justice Louis Brandeis. But is privacy a civil right? Who hears the word privacy and thinks about equality? Pardon me, I know that. Who hears the word privacy and thinks about equality? Who hears the word surveillance and thinks about racism or bigotry or intolerance? Some, not many. Nowadays, the motto is that everyone is watched. We are all tracked. And what's more, we don't really talk about privacy as this felt, visceral thing. Privacy is in the business or technology section of the newspaper. It's about cookies on browsers. It's about data breaches. It's about Mark Zuckerberg and the NSA. And of course, yes, in a sense, that's right. But at its heart, privacy is about human dignity. Whether the government feels it can invade your dignity, and whether the government feels it has to protect the most sensitive, the most intimate information about your life. And invasions of privacy, that watching and tracking and listening and sharing of data, those invasions do not affect everyone equally. Instead, across our history, you see that there is a color to surveillance. You see patterns. Pattern. We watch those who are less than. Will you spy on your superior, or will you spy on the poor man, the person of color, the immigrant, the heretic? We watch those who are other. pattern. When those others organize and mobilize, that watching is redoubled. Surveillance becomes a tool to stop marginalized people from achieving power. Today, I want to trace those patterns through key moments in our history. I want to talk about how government has largely failed to reckon with those patterns. And in brief, I want to talk about what that reckoning might look like. Yes, privacy is a civil liberty. I'm here to tell you that also privacy is a civil right. And so when we talk about privacy only as a civil liberty, we erase those patterns of harm. We erase that color of surveillance. And when we talk about privacy only as a civil liberty, we also ignore the benefits of privacy. Yes, surveillance threatens vulnerable people fighting for equality, but privacy is what protects them and can make it possible. So let's start near the beginning. When he was the chair of the Subcommittee on Defense Appropriations, again, one of the most powerful subcommittees in Congress, Senator Chavez would sit next to a senator from Massachusetts named Leverett Saltonstall, the ranking Republican on that subcommittee. And he was every bit the Boston Brahmin that his name suggests. In fact, he could trace his family back to the Mayflower. And so when Senators Chavez and Saltonstall would sit down next to each other, maybe the hearing was about to start, the executive committee hadn't gotten started yet, they would make small talk. And one of their favorite subjects was, whose family came here first? You know where this is going. Was it Senator Saltonstall's family? Or was it Senator Chavez's family? It was Senator Chavez's family. In 1598, the Spanish explorer Pedro Durán y Chavez arrived in this land that we now call New Mexico and settled here thanks to a land grant from the Spanish crown. Senator Saltonstall's family landed at Plymouth Rock in 1620. And so when people asked about his ancestry, Gloria tells me, Senator Chavez would helpfully tell people that he was American since before Plymouth Rock. There's a reason Senator Chavez would say that, and probably wasn't just because of his friend, Senator Saltonstall. That's because Plymouth Rock is more than a place, right? It is a part of the American origin story. Remember what he said. Our nation was created by dissenters. Your ancestors and my ancestors left their homes because they were dissenters. What were the Pilgrims dissenting against? What were they dissatisfied with in the late 1500s, early 1600s Tudor England? In grade school, we learned, Pilgrims worshiped differently than their neighbors. They were mistreated. They left England and settled in New England. The reality is darker. When Elizabeth I came to the throne in 1558, she wanted to be religiously tolerant. But after the Catholic Pope excommunicated her, that was wiped away. She built a network of spies and informants to root out perceived threats to her reign, and her main focus was on Catholics. Catholics feared that their neighbors, as a result of that, would report them to the authorities, and in fact, a system of bounties was created for telling on your Catholic neighbor. This system of network reporting, this system of surveillance was such that many Catholics actually built secret compartments into their houses called priest holes, where clergy could hide if an agent of the crown happened to stop by the house. Now, in fairness, a small group of Catholics was trying to murder Queen Elizabeth. Perhaps you've heard of one of them, their members, Guido Fawkes, who you may know as Guy Fawkes of the famous gunpowder plot. Now, life is weird. Now, Guy Fawkes has become something of a mascot for the anonymous hacking group. You never know. But it wasn't just about Catholics. It wasn't just about Guy Fawkes, Guido Fawkes. Elizabeth also trained her attention on the Puritan separatists that we now know as Pilgrims. Under her reign and under that of her successor, James I, also a Tudor, the Pilgrims also lived in a surveillance state. Example, the governor of Plymouth Colony was a man named William Bradford. He had been a passenger on the Mayflower, and when he wrote about the Pilgrims' time in England, he described being, quote, hunted and persecuted, their houses beset and watched night and day. It was a dystopia. So much so that at the end of her reign, Elizabeth commissioned a special portrait. the so-called rainbow portrait, which you've been seeing today. Perhaps those of you in the front row noticed Elizabeth's gown. It is embroidered in human eyes and ears. Experts say that she wanted to tell her subjects, quote, "The Queen watches and listens vigilantly, seeing in all perspectives and hearing in all directions." Plymouth Rock, the Pilgrims. This origin story of our republic isn't just a story about religious persecution. It is a story about surveillance, about a government's need to watch and control a heretical minority. This did not just happen in England, as I am sure you know, here in the Southwest. In the Utah Territory, our neighbors to the northwest, a different yet similar drama unfolded. In 1882 and 1887, Congress passed the Edmunds Act and the Edmunds-Tucker Act, cracking down on the practice of polygamy among Mormon settlers. These acts gave federal courts blanket power to access church documents, and it also let federal prosecutors force a spouse to testify against their spouse, a wife typically against her husband. Using these tools in this period, the federal government prosecuted 2,300 Mormons for sex crimes. Reflect on this for a moment. The first wave of federal sex crimes prosecutions was waged not against LGBT people or LGBT service members in the 20th century. It was waged against members of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints in the late 19th century. So why am I talking about this? How did federal prosecutors find 2,300 Mormons to prosecute? By watching them night and day. Federal agents patrolled the streets, they monitored homes, and they raided those houses as they saw fit. In 1886, the women of Salt Lake actually wrote an open letter to Congress asking for help. "We direct your attention," I quote, "to the outrages perpetrated by rough and brutal deputy marshals who watch around our dooryards, peer into our bedroom windows, ply little children with questions about their parents, and when hunting their human prey, burst into people's domiciles and terrorize the innocent." We watch those who are other. We watch those who are less than. And there is a fascinating wrinkle in the Mormon story in the 1880s which underscores this. And that is that the Mormon population at the time was white. And so how did anti-Mormons justify this campaign to the American public? Well, they insisted that the Mormons weren't really white. They weren't really Christian. They were actually Muslims. This is a slide from Puck. Or Mohammedans, as they were called in that era. A few representative samples. Quote, "Modern Mohammedanism has its Mecca at Salt Lake." Quote, "Turkey is in our midst." Quote, "The prophet Joseph Smith closely resembles his master and model, Muhammad." When we talk, and I want to pause because when we talk about the history of surveillance and its disparate impact, we have to be careful. Because we can't reinforce, we can't reify the idea that the targets of surveillance are helpless victims. Often, in fact, the other is being watched precisely because they are fighting back. And sometimes the others win. And that watching fails and is utterly useless. Members of the New Mexico legislature, as I know you all know, recently sought to create a holiday in memory of not just Dennis Chavez, but also Cesar Chavez. And that holiday would have actually fallen, by my reckoning, tomorrow, on the first Friday of April. So let's talk about Cesar Chavez. The FBI surveilled Cesar Chavez for roughly a decade. They justified the initial surveillance of Cesar Chavez partly in the fact that a communist newspaper ran this photo of Dolores Huerta, not Chavez, but Huerta. And that FBI investigation intensified when the FBI learned that the photographer who took the photo in that communist newspaper was, surprise, likely a communist. So the FBI was off to the races. The FBI followed Cesar Chavez everywhere he went. Farm workers picket Delano, grape growers, FBI's there. Farm workers march to the San Joaquin Valley to Sacramento, FBI on the route. Farm workers begin to organize in the Rio Grande Valley, FBI follows. The final FBI file on Dennis Chavez was 1,500 pages long. It listed Chavez's daily routine, what he ate for breakfast, the specific songs that Joan Baez sang at his rallies, his relatives, where they worked, where they lived. It was a minutely detailed portrait of Cesar Chavez's life that has actually proven quite useful for modern historians of the farm worker civil rights movement. What won't you find in those 1,500 pages? A single incriminating detail. Cesar Chavez was not a communist. His associates, not communists. He was faithful to his wife. He did not misuse union funds. And when the farm workers demonstrated, when they used their bodies to effect change, they were not violent. They turned the other cheek. In fact, there are actually FBI telegrams on farm worker protests that literally say in all caps, extremely orderly. And there's a note of frustration to them because the FBI never caught Cesar Chavez for anything. Now, unfortunately, Cesar Chavez's story is not common. The man is basically a saint. The rest of us are human. Marcus Garvey was human. The J. Edgar Hoover followed him also. His agents would literally peer into the windows of his hotel rooms. But Hoover actually hadn't caught Garvey on anything yet until the government got a hold of a marketing brochure for stock in the Black Star Line, which Garvey founded and ran, showing the world that African Americans could be captains of industry and commerce too. This brochure showed a handsome steamship named for Phillis Wheatley, the famous African American poet. And if you could zoom in a little bit, and unfortunately I don't have the zoom, you'd see the name Phillis Wheatley on this steamship. But Garvey had moved too quickly. He was negotiating for that ship and it was close to sail. He didn't own it yet. In fact, there was no such ship that had those letters on its side. And the sale fell through. So when the government learned this, it used it to charge and convict Garvey of mail fraud. They sent him to prison and they deported him in 1927. Billie Holiday was human. In 1939, she stood on the stage of a nightclub in Greenwich Village and sang a protest poem against lynching, which many of you are familiar with. Quote, "Southern trees bear a strange fruit, blood on the leaves and blood at the root, black body swinging in the southern breeze, strange fruit hanging from the poplar trees." That song and her protest against lynching was a sensation. But Holiday was an addict. And immediately after Strange Fruit entered her repertoire, the head of the then Federal Bureau of Narcotics, a predecessor to the modern Drug Enforcement Administration, assigned an undercover agent to follow Holiday, to ingratiate himself into her circle, and eventually set her up for a drug bust. Holiday went to prison for a year. She was stripped of her cabaret license, which meant she could no longer sing in any nightclub. It was the start of a long decline. And as many of you know, the Reverend Martin Luther King Jr. was human. Hoover's FBI followed him, wiretapped him, and bugged his hotels. Senior FBI officials compiled a recording of his extramarital affairs and sent it to his wife. Sent it to his office, actually, along with a note threatening blackmail and implying that Dr. King should kill himself. The package was then forwarded to the King family home. Apparently, Coretta Scott King enjoyed listening to recordings of Dr. King's speeches, and it was she who opened it. "They are out to break me," Dr. King told a friend. "They are out to get me, harass me, and break my spirit." Now, it's easy to focus on J. Edgar Hoover, but these patterns predated him, and they continue to this day. So let's talk about how those patterns continue today. In January 2017, when the president barred travel to the United States from several Muslim-majority countries, people mobilized en masse. They went to those airports. Fewer people, however, focused on a different provision in Section 4 of that same executive order. Section 4 called for every traveler to the U.S. to be, quote, vetted to see if they would, quote, become a positively contributing member of society, close quote. and if they would be able to, quote, make contributions to the national interest. Now, I'm sure there are immigration law scholars in the room today, and they would know that these are either entirely duplicative forms of vetting or forms of vetting that find no purchase in American federal immigration law because they do not exist. These standards are either duplicative or non-existent. Fewer people still notice the ICE procurement documents posted in the summer of 2017 proposing to build out a system to implement Section 4. How are they going to build it out? Well, according to the documents, Immigration and Customs Enforcement wanted to automatically and continuously scan immigrants' social media, their Facebook, their Twitter, their Instagram posts. The plan was to flag a minimum of 10,000 people a year for deportation investigations. Thankfully, a coalition of civil rights and privacy organizations was able to stop that system. But unfortunately, we have seen no limit to these kinds of abuses. An administration that sees immigrants as drug dealers, as animals, as monsters, as rapists, will do anything it wants to a vulnerable person, to a vulnerable immigrant. It will break any law, violate any norm, even take advantage of a child's pain and trust. What do I mean by that? Let's talk about a story that ran in Santa Fe, New Mexico 2 years ago. There's a teenager living in Guatemala with his uncle. He hasn't seen his brother's named Gary, in more than a decade. And Gary actually lives in Santa Fe. But the teen needs to get out. His uncle abuses him. So he leaves his village, he crosses Sonora, and he shows up at the Arizona border. The teen is taken into custody. Officials from our government ask him, quote, "Do you have any other close family members who live in the U.S.?" And as you might imagine, this question actually scares a lot of children because they know that a lot of their family is undocumented. And that if they were to give that information, it would put that family at risk. But the kids are terrified. They want to be with their families. And so they take the risk. And they give the Office of Refugee Resettlement, their names. And in this case, Gary's brother gave them his name and phone number. So Gary gets a call in Santa Fe. He lives with his wife, Marisol, who's actually pictured here. And their 2 kids, one 7 months and one 11 years old. Gary is undocumented. The government official at the end of the line assures him that if he gives them his information, that won't be used to find and deport him. It will be just used to reunite him with his brother. So he does that. He tells them where he lives. He gives them that information. He wants to take care of his little brother. By the time the Santa Fe, New Mexican ran the story, Gary wasn't living in Santa Fe anymore. He was in a detention facility in Chaparral, waiting for his deportation hearing. Once his brother told the government his name, and once Gary came forward, ICE came for him, arrested him, and placed him in deportation proceedings. That's because since last summer, ICE has publicly reserved the right to use information obtained from scared, detained children at the border to find, arrest, and deport their families. And it's happened to over 150 people, including at least 3 here in New Mexico. There's a detail here that I think is haunting. Last fall, when a coalition of NGOs wrote a letter to DHS and HHS denouncing what was happening, there was an unusual number of Japanese-American organizations who signed on. The Japanese-American Citizens League, the Fred T. Korematsu Center for Law and Equality, the Japanese-American Service Committee. There are lots of other civil rights groups, but no other national origin group that was represented like that. Why? Well, it turns out that in the 1940s, when our government ordered Japanese Americans into internment camps to be incarcerated, they had help from the census. In 1940, Japanese American families were surveyed, and they were promised, because federal law told them, that their information would remain confidential. But Congress waived those rules. 1942. And then the government used that confidential census data to find and incarcerate Japanese Americans in internment camps like the ones that were here in New Mexico, in Lordsburg and Santa Fe. On May 12, 1950, when Senator Chavez said, "We are a nation of dissenters," when he said, "Your ancestors and my ancestors left their homes because they were not satisfied. He wasn't just talking about pilgrims. He was talking about immigrants. He was talking about activists. He was talking about vulnerable people who dared to want more. Surveillance is a tool that the powerful use to stop that. On June 6th, 2013, I was sitting down for dinner at Bertucci's on Connecticut Avenue in Washington, D.C., and my BlackBerry started lighting up. And I opened it up, and Edward Snowden had just revealed that the NSA was tracking the calls of not one, not some, but millions of Verizon customers, all Verizon Business Services customers. And that leak ushered in the most intense and important surveillance debate in a generation. At that time, I was the chief counsel of the Senate Judiciary Subcommittee on Privacy, Technology, and the Law, and it was my job to run one of the key subcommittees tasked with finding out what the NSA was doing and then writing legislation to rein the NSA in. No more pizza. And the next year was a blur of hearings and negotiations. And actually, the NSA would do this brilliant thing. They negotiate in good faith, but they would do this brilliant thing where they would send all these guys into a negotiation. They walk into the room, and after this long negotiation, they'd agree to something. And then for the next negotiation, they would send a totally different group of people that had like no recollection of the first conversation. It was brilliant. But we made some progress. We passed an NSA reform bill with many strengths and many weaknesses. Yet even then, in that haze of activity, I remember thinking to myself, when are we going to talk about the history of surveillance and the people it affects? We're calling business groups to testify, civil liberties groups. Why aren't we calling civil rights groups? Once I left the Senate and had the chance to go to Georgetown Law, I had the time to reread transcripts and reread all the news stories in that period. And it turns out it was worse than I thought, and here's why. Because it turns out that 3 months after Edward Snowden went public, the NSA itself disclosed that it wasn't just the FBI who'd wiretapped Martin Luther King. The NSA had wiretapped Dr. King also, along with Whitney Young, who's just over his left shoulder from the National Urban League, and Muhammad Ali. This was part of Operation Minaret, an operation aimed at finding out if U.S. political activists were working with the Soviet Union, which they were not. Now, in any legislature, Congress, state legislature, when you debate policy, you talk about the highs and lows. And what I mean by that is you talk about, what happens when everything goes great and what happens when everything goes terrible. What's the worst possible thing that can happen? And in 2013 and 2014, the threat of surveillance to civil rights wasn't this amorphous, ambiguous thing. It was staring us in the face. And you would think that the senators would debate that. They didn't. There were 10 NSA reform hearings in the Senate between Edward Snowden's first leak and ultimate passage of the USA Freedom Act. That was the bill to reform the NSA 2 years later. There were countless floor speeches about the NSA, yet in the entirety of that debate, never, not once, did anyone even say Martin Luther King's name. The senators never discussed, in fact, any aspect in depth of how surveillance can be and has been used to target and harm racial and religious minorities. The senators talked about how the revelations hurt the relationships with our allies. They quantified in dollars the cost of lost clients to American cloud computing companies and other American tech companies. They called 3 separate industry witnesses to talk about it. The senators even spoke about the harm of leaks to the military, which I guess is logical. They talked about the harm to morale, to reputation, to recruiting. But when it came time to talk about how NSA spying was affecting people, it was a high-level discussion about a right to privacy, free speech, about chilling effects. It was all about how the spying had violated the privacy of millions of Americans, all my constituents. It was the same story of everyone has watched. Now here again, I want to pause because, to be honest, I'm just as guilty as the other folks in the Senate were. I organized one of those hearings. I called one of those industry witnesses when I could have called a civil rights witness. And I staffed my boss at numerous other hearings, floor speeches, and public events. I was part of the problem. But what I want to stress to you is that what happened in that NSA reform debate is the rule, not the exception. When Congress meets to talk about surveillance, be it police surveillance, but particularly NSA surveillance, it is the exceptional member of Congress who sees those patterns and who talks about them and works to reverse them. Some good news. In the last 2 years, this has started to change. In particular, Chairman Elijah Cummings of the House Oversight Committee, Chairman Benny Thompson of the House Homeland Security Committee, Representative Cedric Richmond of the Congressional Black Caucus, and others are starting to ask questions. Questions about racial bias and face recognition technology. Questions about how ICE planned to scan social media of all immigrants to target deportations. Questions about how surveillance isn't just a threat to liberty. It is a threat to equality also. We still have a long road ahead of us, though. And so in closing, I want to offer, in brief, some thoughts about what it might look like for Congress to finally reckon with the color of surveillance. It looks like Congress calling the NAACP, the Leadership Conference on Civil and Human Rights, Muslim advocates, Color of Change, to testify not just at criminal justice reform hearings, but at hearings involving the NSA and the FBI and CIA. It looks like ICE being asked questions at oversight hearings about the vast surveillance network they have built inside of our country. A surveillance network that turns on automated license plate readers and scans of driver's license photos at our departments of motor vehicles. We have to recognize that ICE is not just a law enforcement agency, it is a surveillance agency also. It looks like acknowledging the obvious fact that the primary goal of so much domestic surveillance is simply watching and controlling Muslim people. It looks like quantifying the impact of surveillance, not just on Google or Facebook or Amazon Web Services, but on people, non-corporate people. For years, Senator Ron Wyden of Oregon has demanded that the intelligence community estimate how many Americans had their communications collected under Section 702. This is an NSA program that actually collected the content of communications, not just the metadata. That's great, but Congress needs to go further. It's not enough to count people. Congress should also ask who they are, at least in general terms. Where do they live? Where do they come from? What do they look like? Right this second, you can actually go online and pull down how many times federal judges here in New Mexico have ordered wiretaps, the crimes that those wiretaps were used to investigate, how many people were arrested, how many people, of all those people arrested, were actually convicted. Wiretaps have been around for ages. Why can't we do this for any surveillance technology invented in the 21st century? The last part of this vision I want to leave you with is a hopeful one. And I've spent pretty much the entirety of this lecture talking about how surveillance harms vulnerable people. We can't forget, however, how privacy empowers them. Harriet Tubman escaped bondage on the eastern shore of Maryland in 1849. And as everyone knows, after she escaped, she began going back and rescuing other enslaved people and guiding them to freedom. What most people do not realize is that Harriet Tubman, returned repeatedly to the one region where she would be most recognizable and most at risk, the eastern shore of Maryland. She wanted to free the rest of her family, and she did, and she was never caught. After the Civil War, Tubman struggled to obtain a pension for her service in the Union Army. And so in 1868, a group of abolitionists organized for a biography to be published about Tubman to both publicize her story and raise funds for her. And they called on Tubman's peers, and you can only imagine who Tubman's peers were in that day, to write testimonials on her behalf. And Frederick Douglass answered that call and wrote one of those testimonials. And let me read you an excerpt of what he wrote. Most of what I have done, and he addresses this to Harriet Tubman herself, most of what I have done and suffered in the service of our country has been public. You, on the other hand, have labored in a private way. I have wrought in the day, you in the night. I have had the applause of the crowd, while the most that you have done has been witnessed by a few trembling, scarred, and footsore bondmen and women. The midnight sky and the silent stars have been the witnesses of your devotion to freedom and your heroism. There was a time when it was legal. That's what Frederick Douglass wrote. And he wrote that because, there was a time when it was legal to own people and illegal for them to run away. There was a time, not so long ago, when it was basically illegal for black people to march in the streets of Selma. When there is that moral lag, that gap between what is legal and what is right, privacy is the shield that allows the unpopular and persecuted to survive, even thrive. It is what allows them to labor in a private way, far beyond the government's eyes. And so as we build this world of pervasive surveillance, we have to ask ourselves, are we building a world without underground railroads? Are we building a world where that kind of dissent is impossible? Thank you so much for your time and attention. Thank you. Sure, I'd be glad to. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you so much. Thank you very much. Thank you. Thank you, Gary. Great. That's very generous. Thank you. I think we have a little bit of time, and so I'd be glad to answer any questions about any of that. I realized I packed a lot into that lecture, so happy to talk about any of that or anything related. Comments are also fine, yeah. I did. Yeah. Yeah, no, the issue is that I only had like 45 minutes, and so, to be honest, most of my time was devoted to, in the Senate, was devoted to oversight over private actors. It was really only when Edward Snowden came out that we had to switch our focus. I actually used to be more pessimistic about surveillance of corporate actors, on behalf of corporate actors. And it's because one thing I was talking about with some of the students who I had the pleasure of meeting with earlier today is that this really funny thing has happened with consumer privacy, so privacy vis-a-vis Facebook, Google, Instagram, Amazon. And it's that Congress, and Gloria, you probably know this more than pretty much anyone else in the room, Congress used to regulate privacy. Congress used to pass laws to regulate privacy. So Congress passed a law regulating privacy on telephones, and the FCC's job was to enforce that. And in fact, Congress then updated it to account for the creation of geolocation information. Congress passed a law to protect our children online, the Children's Online Privacy Protection Act. They passed a law to protect cable information, credit cards, health information. They updated that health law. But then in 2009, Congress stopped. They passed the update to the health privacy law, and they stopped. And that's when I actually started working in Congress in 2009. And what happened is that all the tech companies started creating lobbying operations in Congress. And the thing to realize is that never before in our nation's history have the most valuable companies in our country and the world had as their raw material personal information. And so when you have as your raw material personal information, when that is literally, what creates your bottom line, you will do everything, and it's logical, you will do everything in your capacity to protect that flow. And so Congress hasn't passed there's actually a very strange law that Amy Klobuchar passed that regulates black boxes off cars, but it has no enforcement mechanism. So it's this kind of little odd duck that's floating out there. But other than that, Congress hasn't passed a single consumer privacy law since 2009. And so one thing I was telling the students today is if you think of a technology, a consumer technology, be it face recognition, be it drones, be it geolocation, be it Alexa, right? Be it the smart whatever you have in your home, those technologies are either inartfully or incompletely regulated, or they're entirely unregulated when it comes to privacy. So I could talk your ear off about it, but instead what I wanted to, and frankly, so much of writing this lecture was keeping stuff out because there were so many things. I'll just share one thing. There was a story that ran in the newspaper in Santa Fe that Senator Chavez brought to the floor of the Senate, and he quoted it, and he said, hey, look, this company was able to run an ad in Albuquerque for waitresses, whites only. What's that? and waiters, whites only, right? And you got people coming back from World War II, right, who've been bleeding for the country. This is what you're going to do to them. And the thing to realize is that nowadays, the way that these platforms are structured, you never see the ad unless it's for you. And so what Facebook actually just got sued on by the Department of Housing and Urban Development was this, that they actually, so if you're Latino, if you're African American, there actually isn't somewhere on Facebook where you're like, I am Latino, right? You don't, go look, it's not there. It's because Facebook would create affinity groups. It would track you and then figure out who had an affinity for Latinos or African Americans, et cetera. And surprise, surprise, most of those folks, not entirely, but usually are African American or Latino themselves. And Facebook allowed people to show all sorts of ads, including housing ads, to people and be like, I will not show these to African American affinity folks. And so that said, and I realized that to be a privacy advocate is to be like the world's worst wet blanket, to be like, oh, horrible thing. But I do think there's hope. I think Congress, the Cambridge Analytica scandal, the repeat, inability of Facebook to fix its ways, wonder whether that's really doable given the structure of their model. I think it's such that you're actually seeing people work across the aisle. So, for example, Senator Schatz from Hawaii and Senator Blunt from Missouri introduced a bill to regulate commercial face recognition, which actually has some serious problems, but it is leagues better than anything I would have expected from a previous Congress. So there is hope, I think, on that. Yeah. Any other questions or comments? Yes.
How has school surveillance changed over the years?
Ooh, yes. School surveillance. How has it changed over the years? I'm not an expert in this, but I will tell you some trends. There is the FERPA, the Federal the Education Privacy Law, which most folks agree is in need of an update. Most privacy advocates agree is in need of an update. But the thing that I'm particularly watching and that our center is watching is the use of face recognition in schools. And it's actually, and this is pretty perverse, it's being used to tell schools they can stop school shootings, which, if you just think about it for 2 seconds, it doesn't make sense. It's this idea that you're going to know who's going to commit the school shooting, and then you're going to upload them to the watch list, and then these people who you think are going to commit school shootings, there's so many of them, you need a computer to look for them. Not the people who know them and work at the school. But then the other thing is that face recognition doesn't work on young people's faces as well as it does. Fun things you learn, in this profession. Our faces change mostly between age 0 and 20, and then 50 onward. Between 30 and 50, the face mostly stays the same. But young folks' faces, they change a lot. And so you're marketing a surveillance technology that's already biased, that already suffers, that's poor identifying women, poor identifying African Americans or people with darker skin tones, and then saying, oh no, now we're going to try to spot kids, right, teenagers. So I think schools, unfortunately, are becoming this locus for a lot of this technology. And the other thing is that a lot of internet companies are partnering with schools, for example, Google, to offer their systems. And this is a very logical thing because then you get used to it and then you use it afterwards. But schools are not immune from any of the trends that we were just talking about either, yeah.
What are, or do you think, instances in which the right to privacy might be limited?
Sure, yeah. So, we in 2016 wrote a report on face recognition, on police face recognition. And it was the first survey of its kind, and we proposed some policies for how it should be used. And it's one thing in face recognition. So let's say someone comes in and they love, the sign, and so they steal it, right? They love the podium. Who knows what they steal? They steal something. And then you have a photo of them and you look for that person, okay? That's one thing, right? It's another thing to set up in front of a school and scan every single face, man, woman, child, who comes by. The latter is face surveillance. The former is what's called face identification or forensic face identification. And face surveillance, when you let it loose in public spaces, changes the nature of public spaces. And so to answer your question, to be very honest, I'm comfortable with a world where there's no face surveillance because of the errors and because of the fact that it turns the Fourth Amendment on its head. But I think it would be reasonable for people to say, we're looking for Jahar Tsarnaev on the streets of Boston. Let's use face recognition. We're looking for these escaped fugitives who killed someone in upstate New York. Let's use face recognition in that instance. Face surveillance in that instance. I think that's a reasonable thing. I don't agree with it for the reasons stated, but I think emergencies are a case. Exigent circumstances, something that every lawyer and law student here will know well. I think there's, like every right, there should be exceptions to it. But unfortunately, what you have are no rules, and so everything's an exception for things like face recognition, for example. Yeah. One more question? Wonderful. One more question, comment, thought? Yes.
Recently, I heard a comment that we are in what could be considered the second industrial revolution.
Right.
The first one was exploiting natural resources,
Right.
minerals, water. This one is the data,
Right.
the behavioral trends, that is the new resource.
Right.
Would you comment on that and the fact that if this is the case, how do we start to move to protect
Right. Yeah.
that?
So, what I was talking about earlier is categorical, and what you just said is categorically true. That is a true statement. What I think is most interesting, and we talked about this in the session with the students, is this belief that we can't regulate tech. They move too quickly. They're innovating too fast. You don't want to stifle innovation. And the thing is, we regulated Standard Oil. We broke apart Standard Oil. We regulated car companies. We regulated meatpacking plants. We regulate. Yes, tech is exciting. Tech is new. It is not unheard. This is not something we've never seen before. We are seeing extraordinarily powerful and wealthy companies who hire extraordinarily smart people to make very persuasive arguments that you shouldn't regulate them. And so I think it's entirely possible to regulate them. And I think, frankly, someone in the session with the students said, how do we teach kids to protect their privacy? And the thing is, how do you teach someone to not die in a car that's designed to kill you, when you crash? We're going to teach everyone to bundle up in a very particular way. No, you fix the car, right? You have seat belts. And you should go back and read about what the car manufacturers said about the seat belts when Ralph Nader was coming. How are we going to change the assembly lines? This is too expensive. And what if people are trapped? This is too dangerous. We have to study this. This is a big change. But no, you regulate them. Seat belts. Put on seat belts. You shouldn't have lights at the back of the car that impale people. The steering column shouldn't impale people. Crazy idea. And they're just fine. They didn't go bankrupt. They face external competition, but those folks had to have seat belts also. So I think that it is a myth that you cannot regulate Silicon Valley without impeding the amazing things they do. It's a myth that you can't regulate Silicon Valley without impeding innovation. It's a myth that you can't regulate Silicon Valley. Yeah, I think I did it right. It's been a long day. But the exciting thing, what you can do, you've got some great senators and members of Congress. Senator Heinrich, Senator Udall, Senator Xochitl Torres-Small. I mean, these are folks who can make a difference. And now Senator Udall, in particular, has been a very outspoken advocate against government surveillance. But I do think he's very interested in the private sector also. And what we need is people calling members of Congress to say, hey, what the heck is this? This is you falling asleep at the wheel. This is what you need to do to fix this. So, I think there is a lot of hope, and there is a road forward. Thank you again so much. This is wonderful. Oh, sure, okay.
Just hang out here. Thank you, Professor Bedoya. This was wonderful. And now Gloria and her brother Jorge would like to give you a little gift in recognition of...
We want to do it over there.
Oh, sure, okay. Wow. Thank you. Thank you so much.
In addition, while Gloria is still up here, we from the law school would like to give her a gift in recognition of the 10th anniversary of this lecture series.
You can go. Thank you all for being here so much. We appreciate it.